Blood Hand on Horseback, The Lone Cowboy and the Cherokee Girl. They say a man facing death sees his whole life flash before his eyes. Jackson Cole saw only one thing: Sarah Blackwood's face. The gunshot split the silence of the Wyoming night. Jackson pressed his back against the boulder, his calloused hand gripping the empty Winchester Model 1873 rifle, the same rifle his father had carried at Gettysburg. Blood from the wound in his shoulder pulsed in time with his racing heart, each drop painting the pristine snow crimson. Three of Silas Blackwood's gunmen stalked through the darkness, their lanterns casting long, grotesque shadows against the ancient pines. Their boots crunched in the snow. Closer now, 20 yards, maybe less. Not far away, a young girl huddled beneath a massive pine, her eyes wild with fear, her face bearing the purple evidence of her father's cruelty. The belt marks were fresh, angry welts that told a story no child should have to bear. "Sarah," Jackson whispered, his breath forming ghosts in the frigid air. "When I start shooting, you run north. Follow the creek just like I told you. Don't stop until you find Solo's cabin." "But you're out of bullets," she whispered back, her voice trembling like aspen leaves in autumn wind. Jackson pulled a Remington Derringer from his boot, a gunfighter's last resort. The moonlight glinted off its engraved barrel as he checked the twin chambers. "Got 2 shots left." He snapped the small firearm shut with practiced hands. "That's enough to buy you time." In that moment, as he stared into Sarah's eyes, Jackson knew with bone-deep certainty these might be his last breaths on God's earth. He'd been a ranch hand all his life, never aspired to heroism. But if his death meant Sarah Blackwood could escape the living hell of her father's house, he reckoned it a fair trade. A bullet splintered bark inches from his head, showering him with wood chips. The sound echoed across the valley like thunder. "There!" one of the men shouted, his lantern beam cutting through the darkness. "I see him!" No more time. "Remember what I taught you about the stars," Jackson said quickly, thumbing back the Derringer's hammer. "North Star guides you straight to Solo. The man owes me a debt from Shiloh. He'll honor it." Then he fired his first shot, striking the lantern with deadly accuracy. Glass shattered, oil splashed, and flames erupted with a violent whoosh. In the chaos and sudden darkness, Jackson bellowed, "Run, Sarah! Now!" Sarah Blackwood bolted into the darkness, her slight frame swallowed by shadow. Clutched in her hand was the small stone pendant, her Cherokee mother's final gift before dying, the one thing her father would kill to possess. The pendant that, according to her mother's whispered deathbed instructions, would lead her to the one person who could protect her, the mysterious mountain hermit known only as Solo. As gunfire erupted behind her, Sarah ran blindly through the snow-covered forest. Tears froze on her cheeks as the sounds of battle faded behind her. Jackson's second shot, then answering gunfire, then silence. He had sacrificed himself for her. She didn't know if he was alive or dead, only that every step carried the weight of his sacrifice. She wouldn't waste it. The wind picked up, howling like a wounded animal, obliterating the sounds of potential pursuit. Sarah pushed forward, each labored breath burning her lungs. The snow grew deeper, the cold more biting. Hours passed in a daze of exhaustion and numbing cold. Finally, her legs betrayed her. She stumbled and fell near a half-frozen creek, its surface glittering under the moonlight like broken glass. Her consciousness faded, darkness creeping in from the edges of her vision. Sarah's last coherent thought was of her mother's final words, spoken through fever-cracked lips 5 years ago. "Find the creek keeper. He is your only hope. Terry Connery." Mason Solo. Calloway's eyes snapped open a full minute before dawn painted the eastern sky. 45 years on this earth, and he'd never needed an alarm. His body sensed the sun's approach like other men sensed a storm coming, a skill that had kept him alive through 15 years of Army scouting and the bloodbath at Shiloh, where he'd watched half his regiment die in a single afternoon. Outside his cabin window, the first golden rays illuminated the small clearing, nestled among the towering pines of Whispering Pines mountain range. From his porch, he could see the creek that gave the mountains their name. Locals claimed that on quiet nights, voices echoed in the running water, spirits of the land speaking to those who knew how to listen. Mason's face was a map of hard country, weathered from years under the Wyoming sun, creased like dried leather. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a Cheyenne brave whose life he'd later saved during the Medicine Lodge negotiations. His dark hair, once as black as a raven's wing, now carried threads of silver at the temples. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, had the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd seen too much death to find comfort in crowds. With practiced efficiency, he pulled on his buckskin jacket and strapped on his Remington Navy revolver, the same weapon that had saved his life during the Sioux Uprising of '68. Some habits a man didn't shake, no matter how peaceful his surroundings. In the small corral outside, his Appaloosa stallion nickered a greeting. "Morning, Ghost," Mason said, his voice rough with disuse. Living alone in these mountains, weeks often passed without him speaking a word to another soul. Ghost in the mountains were company enough. He saddled the stallion and rode out to check his snare lines. Game had grown scarce as winter deepened, and the journey to Broken Ridge for supplies was 30 miles of treacherous terrain he undertook only when absolutely necessary. As he rode alongside the creek, Ghost suddenly balked, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. "What is it, boy?" Mason murmured, his hand instinctively moving to the Remington at his hip. The horse snorted, pawing at the snow nervously. Mason dismounted in one fluid motion, his keen eyes scanning the area. That's when he saw them, boot prints in the fresh snow. Too small for a man, a woman perhaps, or a youth. Mason frowned. Nobody ventured this deep into the mountains during winter unless they were either desperate or dangerous, and in his experience, often both. Drops of blood marked the trail, dark red against pristine white. He unholstered his Remington and followed the tracks for nearly half a mile until they led him to the creek's edge. There, half buried in snow like a discarded doll, lay a young girl. Her face was bruised, her clothes torn and bloodstained. She couldn't have been more than 17. Mason knelt beside her, checking for signs of life. She was alive, but barely. Her skin was ice cold, her breathing shallow. Without immediate help, she wouldn't survive another hour. With surprising gentleness for hands so calloused, he lifted her onto Ghost and mounted behind her, cradling her limp body against his chest. As he turned back toward his cabin, something caught his eye, a small stone hanging from a leather cord around the girl's neck. Even half covered by her collar, he recognized the markings etched into its surface. Mason's heart hammered against his ribs. Those markings matched the ones on the old buckskin map his Shoshone wife had entrusted to him before she died, the map to the healing waters. "Who in God's name are you, girl?" he muttered as he spurred Ghost into a gallop. "And what kind of hell did you bring to my mountain?" 3. Sarah drifted through darkness, anchored to life by fevered dreams. Her mother appeared to her, tall and regal, with the same midnight hair and obsidian eyes that Sarah had inherited. In the dream, her mother stood beside a pool of water that glowed with an unearthly blue light inside a mountain cave, beckoning to her daughter. "The water remembers Sarah," her mother said, her voice echoing as if traveling across great distance. "Find the creek keeper." Sarah's eyes fluttered open. Instead of her mother, she found herself staring at a bearded stranger sitting beside a rough-hewn bed. She was in a cabin she didn't recognize, wrapped in animal furs, a fire crackling in a stone hearth nearby. The scent of pine and some unfamiliar herb hung in the air. Panic surged through her. She tried to sit up but found her body strangely heavy. Easy, the man said, his voice low and steady as a mountain stream. You're safe here. Who are you? Sarah demanded, her voice cracking from thirst. Where am I? Name's Mason Calloway, he replied, pouring water from a clay pitcher into a wooden cup. Most folks call me Solo, and you're in my cabin. He offered her the cup. Sarah hesitated, years of hard-earned caution making her wary. But thirst overcame suspicion. She took the cup and drank greedily. Found you half dead by the creek, Mason continued, studying her with eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. Want to tell me why a young girl is running through these mountains in the dead of winter? Sarah's hand flew to her neck, relief washing over her when she felt the stone pendant still there. Her mother's last gift, her only inheritance. My name is Sarah Blackwood, she said finally, her voice stronger. My father is Silas Blackwood. Mason's expression hardened at the name, his jaw tightening visibly. The whiskey man owns half the valley. Yes, Sarah's voice faltered. He killed my mother 5 years ago, said she bewitched him, tricked him into marriage with her savage ways. He's been using me as a servant since then. She touched her bruised face self-consciously, the memory of her father's belt making her flinch involuntarily. What changed? Mason asked, his voice gentler now. Why run now, after all this time? Sarah clutched her pendant protectively. He found my mother's journal last week. It mentioned a special place in these mountains, a source of healing water, something the Cherokee have protected for generations. Mason's eyes narrowed, sharp as a hunting knife. And why would a man like Silas Blackwood care about old Indian legends? My half-brother Thomas is dying of consumption. The doctors have given up on him. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. My father believes the water could save Thomas. When he found out my mother had given me this, she held up the stone pendant. He tried to take it, said it was a map. When I refused, he beat me worse than ever. And how did you escape? Jackson Cole. He worked on my father's ranch. He helped me get away, led the gunman away from me. Her voice broke, the memory of gunfire still fresh. I don't know if he's alive or dead. Something flickered in Mason's eyes. Recognition. Cole? He repeated. About 6 foot, scar across his right cheek. Carries a Winchester 73? Sarah nodded, surprised. You know him. We served together. Shiloh. Bad business. Mason's eyes clouded with memory. He saved my life when a rebel bayonet had my name on it. Good man in a fight. He stood abruptly and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. He unlocked it with a key he wore around his neck and removed something wrapped in oilcloth. When he unwrapped it, Sarah saw a piece of aged buckskin with markings painted on its surface in faded earth tone colors. He brought it back and laid it beside her on the bed. Is this what your father is looking for? He asked, his voice unnaturally tight. Sarah gasped. The symbols on the buckskin matched the ones etched into her stone pendant. Concentric circles, wavy lines representing water, and a strange symbol that looked like a hand with an eye in its palm. How do you have this? She whispered, her fingers hovering over the ancient map, afraid to touch it. My wife, Eleanor, Mason said, his voice softening for the first time, half Shoshone. Her grandmother was a medicine woman who passed this down through generations. Before Eleanor died of the fever 5 years ago, she made me promise to protect the source. He turned away, his hand unconsciously moving to the scar on his face, as if the memory was still too painful. The source killed her, in a way, he added quietly. A white man with the sacred map. The tribes didn't all agree I should have it. Renegades attacked our homestead while I was away scouting for the railroad survey. By the time I returned, the words hung in the air, unfinished. But Sarah understood. Loss had shaped them both. Mason's eyes hardened with self-recrimination. I was tracking a war party 3 ridges over. Should have been home. Would have heard them coming a mile away. He clenched his fist. I buried Eleanor by the source. Seemed fitting. She loved that place. Said it was where heaven touched earth. Sarah stared at him, realization dawning. You're the creek keeper, she whispered. The one my mother told me to find. Mason's eyes widened in genuine surprise. And who was your mother, girl? Hannah Blackwood. Before that, Hannah Two Rivers, Cherokee from the Eastern Territories. Mason sank heavily into the chair beside the bed, running a hand through his graying hair. The name had hit him like a physical blow. I knew Hannah Two Rivers, he said quietly, disbelief coloring his words. When I was scouting for the Army during the relocations, smart woman, fierce, had a gift for healing that even the Army doctors respected. That was her, Sarah confirmed, tears spilling down her cheeks. She always said she'd met a white man who understood the old ways, a man who could hear the water speak. Mason stood abruptly, as if uncomfortable with the direction their conversation had taken, or perhaps with the memories it stirred. Get some rest, he said gruffly, his earlier softness vanishing behind the mask of the mountain hermit. Whatever your father sent after you won't find this place easily, but you're in no condition to travel yet. As he turned to leave, Sarah called out, Mr. Calloway, thank you for saving my life. Mason paused at the door, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the firelight. Don't thank me yet, girl. If Silas Blackwood is half as determined as you say, your troubles, and mine, are just beginning. A4. 3 days passed with surprising swiftness. Sarah's strength returned under Mason's care. He treated her bruises with poultices made from plants he gathered in a small greenhouse attached to the rear of the cabin. An ingenious space filled with herbs and plants that had no business growing in the Wyoming winter. On the 4th day, Mason handed Sarah a pair of moccasins and a fur-lined coat that had belonged to his wife. Time you learn the mountain, he said, his voice brooking no argument. If you're staying, you need to know how to survive here. They spent the morning following game trails through the snow-covered forest. Mason pointed out edible plants hidden beneath the snow, showed her how to identify animal tracks, and demonstrated how to move silently even through crusty snow. Your mother teach you anything about the old ways? He asked as they paused by a frozen stream. Sarah nodded. Some. How to find medicinal plants, how to read weather signs. She had to be careful. My father didn't approve of anything that reminded him she was Cherokee. As they crested a ridge, the wind suddenly picked up, nearly knocking Sarah off her feet. Dark clouds materialized on the horizon, moving toward them with unnatural speed. Storm's coming, Mason said, frowning at the sky. Wasn't due till tomorrow. Something's wrong, Sarah replied, a strange sensation crawling up her spine. This isn't an ordinary storm. Mason looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Before she could answer, the ice beneath her feet began to crack. Sarah stumbled back as fissures spread across the frozen stream. Get back! Mason shouted, grabbing her arm. Too late. The ice gave way, plunging Sarah's legs into the frigid water below. She gasped as the cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Mason hauled her out, but not before she heard it, voices whispering from beneath the ice, urgent and afraid. Danger! Coming! Find us! Daughter of Hannah! Did you hear that? Sarah gasped, shivering violently. Hear what? The creek, she managed through chattering teeth. It's talking to me. Mason's eyes widened. He grabbed her shoulders, his gaze intense. What did it say? Danger is coming, Sarah whispered, the voices still echoing in her mind. We need to go back. Now. They half ran, half slid back down the ridge toward the cabin. As they approached the clearing, Mason suddenly threw out an arm, stopping Sarah in her tracks. He dropped into a crouch, pulling her down with him. What is it? She whispered, "Ryder," he muttered, pointing toward the valley below. 5 of them. Through the trees, Sarah could make out mounted men following the main creek. Even from this distance, she recognized the lead rider's distinctive black coat and wide-brimmed hat, adorned with what looked like a snake's tail. "Rattlesnake Reed," she breathed, fear coiling in her chest like a living thing. "You know him?" Mason asked, his hand moving to his Remington. "He's a bounty hunter. Used to hunt down escaped slaves before the war, then renegade Indians for the army. Now he hunts anyone for the right price." Sarah's voice trembled. "They say he keeps a rattlesnake tail on his hat for every man he's killed. My father must have hired him." "Back to the cabin," Mason ordered. "Now, stay low and step exactly where I step." They moved quickly through the forest, taking a circuitous route to avoid leaving tracks the bounty hunters might follow. When they reached the cabin, Mason immediately began gathering supplies: ammunition, dried meat, medical supplies. "Pack anything you need," he instructed Sarah. "We may have to leave quickly." As Sarah stuffed clothes into a leather satchel, a sound outside made them both freeze. Hoof beats approaching, but just one horse, moving slowly. Mason moved to the window, Remington drawn. After a tense moment, his shoulders relaxed slightly. "It's a young man," he said, "wounded, riding a ranch horse." Sarah pushed past him to look, her heart leaping in her chest. "Jackson!" she cried, rushing for the door. Mason caught her arm with an iron grip. "Wait, could be a trap." But Sarah pulled away, running outside to where Jackson Cole slumped in his saddle, blood soaking his left side, his face pale as the surrounding snow. "Sarah," he gasped as she reached him, relief washing over his pain-etched features. "Found you." He toppled from the saddle. Sarah and Mason caught him, carrying him into the cabin. Jackson's wound was serious. A bullet had grazed his ribs, leaving a furrow that had become infected. As Mason cleaned and treated the injury, Jackson drifted in and out of consciousness, his fevered ramblings punctuated by moments of clarity. "Thought you were dead," Sarah said, holding his hand tightly. "Nearly was," Jackson mumbled. "Silas's men shot me, left me for dead." He grimaced as Mason applied a poultice to the wound. "Took me 3 days to track you here." "How?" Mason demanded, his tone suspicious. "This place isn't on any map." "I made sure of that." Jackson's feverish eyes fixed on Mason with surprising lucidity. "Followed the creek, like the old Cherokee woman told me." "What old Cherokee woman?" Sarah asked, exchanging a puzzled glance with Mason. "In my fever dream," Jackson continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "said her name was Hannah. Said to follow the creek to find her daughter." His eyes closed again. "Said to warn the creek keeper that Rattlesnake is coming, with 6 men." Mason and Sarah exchanged alarmed looks. "We saw 5 riders earlier," Sarah said. "The 6th must be my father," Sarah whispered. "He wouldn't trust anyone else to find the source." A sudden gust of wind rattled the cabin windows. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Sarah gasped as her pendant grew ice-cold against her skin. "The water's afraid," she said, her eyes widening. "I can feel it." Mason checked the loads in his Remington, his expression hardening into granite. "The source is calling you, Sarah. It's trying to protect itself." He strapped on his gun belt with practiced efficiency. "We need to move. Now. If Reed is as good as his reputation, he'll find this place by nightfall." V. They left the cabin as dusk painted the western sky blood red. Mason led the way with Sarah supporting a weakened Jackson between them. The temperature was dropping rapidly and fresh snow had begun to fall. Good for covering their tracks, but potentially deadly if they couldn't find adequate shelter. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, shivering despite her heavy coat. "High Cave," Mason replied tersely. "Used by the Shoshone during tribal wars. Defensible. Hard to find if you don't know it's there." They struggled through deepening snow for nearly 2 hours, climbing steadily higher into the mountains. Jackson tried valiantly to walk on his own, but his wound had taken too much from him. He leaned heavily on Sarah, his breath labored. "Almost there," Mason said, pointing to a rocky outcropping above them. "Cave entrance is hidden behind those boulders." As they reached the base of the outcropping, a sharp crack split the air. A bullet struck the rock beside Mason's head, sending stone splinters flying. "Down!" he shouted, drawing his Remington in one fluid motion and pushing Sarah behind a boulder. Two more shots rang out, kicking up snow where they had been standing moments before. "They found us," Sarah gasped, heart hammering against her ribs. Mason peered around the boulder. In the gathering darkness, he could make out three figures moving through the trees below them. "Just scouts," he muttered. "The main group must still be searching the cabin." He handed Sarah his spare revolver. "You know how to use this?" She nodded, the weight of the weapon familiar in her hand. "My mother taught me. Father never knew." "Good. Stay here with Jackson. I'm going to circle around, try to get behind them." Before Sarah could protest, Mason was gone, moving through the snow with a silence that seemed impossible for a man his size. Minutes passed in tense silence. Jackson, propped against the boulder, struggled to stay conscious. "Should have brought you somewhere safer," he muttered, his face ashen. Sarah squeezed his hand. "You brought me exactly where I needed to be." Suddenly, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. Sarah's pendant grew warm against her skin, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Something's happening," Jackson whispered, noticing her expression. Before Sarah could respond, gunfire erupted below them. 3 rapid shots, then an eerie silence. She held her breath, the revolver steady in her hand. Then came Mason's voice from the darkness. "Sarah, all clear!" She helped Jackson to his feet, and they made their way down to where Mason stood over 3 motionless bodies in the snow. In death, they looked smaller somehow, less threatening. "Reed's scouts," Mason confirmed, retrieving ammunition from the dead men. Not particularly good ones. He led them up a nearly invisible trail to the cave entrance, a narrow fissure in the rock face that opened into a spacious cavern. Inside, old fire pits and stone tools gave evidence of its long use as a refuge. Mason quickly built a fire, its light revealing ancient paintings on the cave walls, images of animals, tribal symbols, and a recurring motif of a blue pool with rays emanating from it like a sun. "The source," Mason explained, seeing Sarah studying the paintings. "The Shoshone call it the Creator's Tear. Legend says it fell from the sky during the creation of the world." As Jackson rested near the fire, Mason showed Sarah how the cave paintings told a story, how the first medicine people found the source, how they learned to use its power for healing, and how they swore to protect it from those who would exploit it. "My wife's grandmother was one of the last traditional keepers," Mason said, touching a handprint on the wall reverently. "When white settlers began pushing into these mountains, the tribal elders decided to hide the source. They created the stone markers and maps that could only be fully understood by those with the gift. Like me," Sarah said softly, "and my mother before me." Mason nodded. "The gift passes through bloodlines, usually from mother to daughter. It's why Eleanor couldn't have children. It broke her heart, thinking the knowledge would die with her. Then she met me. A white man who could hear the water," Sarah finished. "Barely," Mason admitted, a shadow passing over his features. "But enough that she trusted me with the map and the responsibility." He studied Sarah thoughtfully. "I never expected the next keeper to be half Cherokee." Sarah touched her pendant. "The water doesn't care about tribes or race, does it? It just seeks those who will listen." "No," Mason agreed. "It just seeks those who will protect it." A deep rumble shook the cave, dislodging small stones from the ceiling. "What was that?" Jackson asked, struggling to sit up. Dynamite, Mason growled, moving to the cave entrance. Reed's getting impatient. He's trying to blast his way into the mountain. If they keep using dynamite, they could collapse the passages to the source, Sarah said, alarm spreading through her. Or worse, Mason said grimly. They could break through to underground rivers, flood the entire system. The source would be lost forever. What's our plan? Sarah asked. We can't just hide here and let them destroy everything. Mason's expression turned calculating. We fight if we have to, but there might be another way. He hesitated. Your brother, Thomas, he's really dying? Sarah nodded sadly. The doctors gave him 3 months at most. It's why my father is so desperate to find the source. Then perhaps we offer him what he needs without revealing what he wants. 6. By dawn, they had formulated a plan. Rather than continue running or fighting, they would approach Silas Blackwood directly, offering to help Thomas using medicine made from the regular creek water combined with herbs. Powerful healing medicine, but not revealing the true source. It's risky, Jackson warned. Stronger after a night's rest, but still pale. Silas isn't known for his reasonableness. No, Mason agreed, checking his weapons methodically. But he is known for loving his son. That's our leverage. They left the cave carefully, Mason leading them down hidden trails toward the valley where smoke rising above the trees indicated Blackwood's camp. As they approached, Mason signaled for silence, guiding them to a vantage point overlooking the camp. 6 large canvas tents had been erected in a clearing. Men moved about, tending horses and checking weapons. Near the largest tent, Silas Blackwood paced back and forth like a caged bear, his imposing figure unmistakable even from a distance. 12 men total, Mason counted quietly, Reed's bounty hunters and Blackwood's ranch hands. There, Sarah whispered, pointing to a smaller tent set slightly apart from the others. That must be where they're keeping Thomas. Mason nodded. Remember the plan. I'll approach openly. You two wait until I signal. Be careful, Sarah urged, genuine concern in her voice. Rattlesnake always shoots first. Mason gave her a grim smile, checking his Remington one final time. So do I when necessary. He made his way down to the edge of the clearing, then walked openly toward the camp, his hands held away from his weapons. A sentry spotted him immediately, shouting an alarm that brought men running. Within seconds, Rattlesnake Reed and 2 of his men had rifles trained on Mason, while Silas Blackwood strode forward, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. Blackwood was a large man in his 50s, with a full beard streaked with gray and cold eyes that seemed perpetually narrowed in suspicion. He wore expensive clothes that couldn't quite hide the roughness beneath. A man who had clawed his way to wealth and power and never forgot the hunger that drove him. Now that's close enough, Blackwood called when Mason was 20 paces away. State your business. Name's Mason Calloway, Mason replied, his voice steady as a mountain stream. I understand you're looking for someone. Blackwood's eyes hardened. My daughter ran away with something that belongs to me, a family heirloom. Curious heirloom that requires Rattlesnake Reed to retrieve it, Mason observed, his gaze shifting to the bounty hunter. Reed stepped forward, a lean, weather-beaten man with a face like tanned leather and eyes as dead as stones. The rattlesnake tail attached to his hat band wasn't just for show, it was a warning and a promise. I find things, Reed said, his voice a dry rasp that sent a chill down the spine of anyone who heard it. People, objects, doesn't matter. I always find what I'm paid to find. And kill anyone who gets in your way, Mason added. Reed didn't deny it. His thin lips merely curved into what might have been a smile on a more human face. You know where the girl is, Blackwood said. It wasn't a question. I do, Mason confirmed. She's safe, but that's not why I'm here. He turned his attention back to Blackwood. I'm here about your son. Blackwood's composure slipped slightly, revealing the desperate father beneath the hard exterior. What do you know about Thomas? I know he's dying of consumption. I know the doctors have given up. And I know you believe there's a source of healing water in these mountains that can save him. You know where it is, Blackwood breathed, taking an involuntary step forward. I know many things, Mason said evenly, including how to help your son without destroying something precious. He nodded toward Thomas's tent. Let me see him. If I can't improve his condition by tomorrow, you can do what you want with me. Blackwood considered, suspicion warring with desperate hope on his face. And my daughter, he demanded, will return of her own free will if you agree to pardon her and the young man who helped her escape. Reed made a scoffing sound. Don't trust him, Blackwood. It's a trap. But Blackwood was already nodding slowly. Very well. You have until tomorrow. But Reed's men will watch your every move. Try anything, and they'll put a bullet in your brain. Mason allowed himself to be escorted to Thomas's tent. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of illness and medicine. A young man lay on a cot, his face gaunt and pale. His breathing labored. Beside him sat an older man with the bearing of a physician who looked up in surprise at Mason's entrance. Who is this? The doctor demanded. A man who claims he can help, Blackwood replied, following Mason inside. Dr. Miller has been treating Thomas for months. Miller snorted derisively. With all due respect, Mr. Blackwood, I've tried every modern treatment available. Unless this gentleman has access to experimental European medicines, I don't see how he can succeed where science has failed. Not European, Mason said, kneeling beside Thomas's cot. Much older. He examined Thomas carefully, noting the blue tinge to his lips, the way his chest struggled to rise and fall. He's very weak, Mason said finally, but not beyond help. He turned to Blackwood. I need my supplies, and I need water from the creek. Fresh. Blackwood nodded to one of his men. Get whatever he needs. As the man left, Mason studied the tent. Something felt wrong. The back of his neck prickled, an old scout's instinct that had saved his life more than once. His eyes narrowed as he spotted a smudge of dirt on Dr. Miller's otherwise immaculate boots. Fresh dirt with a distinctive reddish tinge found only in one place, the high ridge where they'd encountered Reed's scouts. Mason stood, his body tensing. I also need Sarah. The medicine requires specific preparation that she knows. Blackwood's jaw tightened, but after a moment, he gave a curt nod. Signal her. Mason stepped outside the tent, scanning the camp perimeter. Reed was nowhere to be seen. Neither were two of his men. Mason raised his fingers to his lips and gave a long whistle. Not the signal they'd agreed upon, but a cavalry warning he knew Jackson would recognize. Minutes later, Sarah emerged from the tree line, Jackson supporting her with an arm around her waist. They approached cautiously, both alert to Mason's warning. Blackwood's hand moved to his gun when he saw Jackson, but Mason stepped between them. The boy risked his life for your daughter, he said quietly, while you were beating her. Think about that before you draw that weapon. Something like shame flickered across Blackwood's face before his expression hardened again. But he moved his hand away from his gun. Sarah, he said stiffly. Sarah approached cautiously, her eyes never leaving her father's face. Father, you stole something from me. She touched her pendant. Mother gave this to me before she died. It was never yours. Before Blackwood could respond, a weak voice called from inside the tent. Sarah, is that you? Sarah hurried past her father into the tent, where Thomas lay watching the entrance with feverish eyes. Despite his illness, the family resemblance was clear. The same strong jaw as his father, the same intensity in his gaze. Thomas, Sarah said softly, taking his hand. I'm here. You came back, he whispered. Father said you ran away for good. Not for good, she assured him, smoothing his damp hair from his forehead. Just until I could find help for you. She introduced Mason, explaining that he knew medicines that might help. Thomas studied Mason with surprising alertness given his condition. "You're the man from the mountains," he said. "The one Mother wrote about in her journal." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Your mother wrote about me?" "Not by name," Thomas explained between labored breaths. "She called you the white man who listens to water. Said if we ever needed help after she was gone, we should seek you out." His gaze shifted to Sarah. "But Father burned her journal after she died. Said it was full of pagan nonsense." Blackwood, who had entered behind them, shifted uncomfortably. "Your mother was confused in her final days." "She saw clearly," Mason countered. "Clear enough to know her daughter would need protection someday. Clear enough to know her son might need healing." As they spoke, the man Blackwood had sent for water returned. Mason took the canteen, testing its weight. His eyes narrowed slightly. It was half empty. "This won't be enough," he said. "I need to collect it myself from a specific bend in the creek." "I'll send men with you," Blackwood said immediately. "No," Mason insisted. "The presence of others will disrupt the gathering. It must be done alone, with the proper respect." Blackwood hesitated, suspicion flaring. "How do I know you won't run?" "Because Sarah stays here," Mason replied, his gaze meeting hers significantly. "And I'll leave my weapons as well." Reluctantly, Blackwood agreed. Mason unbuckled his gun belt, handing it to Jackson, who moved to a position near the tent entrance, his stance casual but alert. Mason left the camp, following the creek upstream. Once out of sight, he moved swiftly through the underbrush, circling back toward a spot he'd noticed earlier. Fresh tracks leading away from the creek toward the ridge. He found what he feared: Reed and two of his men laying charges of dynamite at a cave entrance. The bounty hunter had split his forces, keeping up the pretense of cooperation while searching for the source on his own. "That ought to do it," one of the men was saying. "Blast open this whole hillside." "Blackwood wants the source intact," Reed replied, checking the fuse. "But what he doesn't know won't hurt him. Once we find it, we'll be the ones selling healing water to the highest bidder." Mason moved silently through the trees, positioning himself behind them. He picked up a rock and hurled it into the bushes on the opposite side of the clearing. The men spun toward the sound, weapons drawn. "Probably just a deer," one muttered. "Check it out," Reed ordered. "Can't be too careful." As the man moved away, Mason slipped behind Reed and the remaining hunter. In one swift motion, he brought the edge of his hand down on the hunter's neck, dropping him unconscious. Reed whirled, but too late. Mason's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling. Reed recovered quickly, drawing a knife from his boot. "Should have stayed with the girl, Calloway," he snarled. "Now you'll die up here, and no one will ever find your bones." Mason circled warily. "I've been marked for death by better men than you, Reed. I'm still here. They're not." Reed lunged, the knife slicing through the air where Mason had been a moment before. Mason countered with a savage blow to Reed's ribs, feeling something crack beneath his knuckles. Reed grunted in pain but pressed his attack, the knife a silver blur in the fading light. Mason caught Reed's wrist, twisting until the knife fell to the snow. But Reed drove his knee into Mason's stomach, knocking the wind from him. Both men went down, rolling in the snow, each fighting for advantage. Reed's hand found the knife again. He brought it down in a vicious arc toward Mason's throat. Mason caught his wrist at the last moment, the blade hovering inches from his skin. For a long moment, they were locked together, muscles straining, neither able to overcome the other's strength. Then Mason drove his forehead into Reed's face. There was a sickening crunch as the bounty hunter's nose shattered. Blood sprayed across the snow. Reed howled in pain, his grip on the knife loosening just enough for Mason to twist it free. Mason scrambled to his feet, knife in hand, as Reed staggered back, blood streaming down his face. "It's over, Reed," Mason said, breathing hard. "Tell Blackwood you couldn't find anything. Take your blood money and leave these mountains." Reed spat blood onto the snow. "Nothing's over until I say it is." His hand moved to the pistol at his hip. Before he could draw, Mason hurled the knife. It buried itself in Reed's shoulder, spinning him around with the force of the impact. Reed screamed, clutching at the protruding handle. Mason was on him in an instant, driving him to the ground. He pinned Reed's good arm with his knee and pressed his forearm against the bounty hunter's throat. "Last chance," Mason growled. "Leave these mountains or join your ancestors." Reed's eyes bulged as he fought for breath, but there was no surrender in them, only hate. Mason eased the pressure slightly. "The source isn't meant for men like us, Reed. It's not ours to take." "Then whose is it?" Reed rasped. "It belongs to itself," Mason said, "and to those it chooses to protect it." Reed's laugh was a harsh, broken sound. "You're a fool, Calloway. Water doesn't choose. It's just water." Mason stood, pulling Reed to his feet. "Let's get back to camp. And remember, I could have killed you but didn't. That debt comes due someday." He gathered the dynamite and fuses, tossing them into the creek. Then he collected water from a small pool nearby, filling the canteen to the brim. By the time they returned to the camp, dusk was settling over the valley. Thomas had received his first treatment from Sarah and Jackson, using herbs Mason had left behind. Already the boy's breathing seemed easier, the blue tinge receding from his lips. Blackwood met them at the edge of the clearing, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Reed's bloody face and the knife still protruding from his shoulder. "What happened?" he demanded. "Your bounty hunter had ideas of his own," Mason replied coldly. "Ideas that involved dynamite and double-crossing you." Reed glared but didn't deny it. "Is that true?" Blackwood asked, his voice dangerously soft. "The mountain man is lying," Reed spat. "Jumped me while I was scouting the ridge, trying to buy time while the girl escapes." "Sarah's still here," Mason pointed out, "and I brought back what I promised." He held up the canteen. "Water that will help your son." Blackwood studied them both for a long moment. Then he nodded to two of his men. "Get Reed to the doctor, then keep him under guard." His cold gaze fixed on the bounty hunter. "We'll discuss your future employment later." As Reed was led away, Blackwood turned back to Mason. "If you're playing me, Calloway, I'll make you beg for death before I'm done." "Your son is already improving," Mason replied. "See for yourself." They returned to Thomas's tent, where Sarah was administering another dose of the herbal tea. The young man was sitting up, color returning to his face. "Father," he said, his voice stronger than before, "the medicine is working. I can breathe again." Blackwood's hard expression softened as he looked at his son. "Rest, Thomas. We'll talk tomorrow." Outside the tent, Mason took Sarah aside. "Reed was setting dynamite charges on the ridge," he murmured. "He's getting desperate." Sarah's hand went to her pendant, which seemed to pulse with warmth. "The source is afraid," she whispered. "I can feel it." "We need to be ready," Mason said. "If Thomas continues to improve, Blackwood might honor his word, but Reed won't give up so easily." As night fell, a storm gathered over the mountains. Not a natural storm, Sarah thought, as she watched the clouds swirl and churn with unnatural speed. The creek was protecting itself the only way it knew how. 7. By midnight, Thomas's fever had broken, and his breathing, while still labored, had become more regular. Dr. Miller examined him with growing amazement. "Remarkable," he admitted grudgingly. "His lungs sound clearer, and his pulse is stronger." Blackwood, who had barely left his son's side, looked at Mason with a mixture of gratitude and lingering suspicion. "How is this possible?" he demanded. "What's in this medicine?" "Knowledge," Mason replied simply. "Knowledge your wife tried to share with you, but you rejected." Blackwood's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Thomas spoke up. "I had a dream last night, Father," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I saw a cave inside the mountain. There was a pool of water that glowed blue, like nothing I've ever seen." Mason and Sarah exchanged alarmed glances. "The woman there," Thomas continued, looking at Sarah, "she had your face, but older. She said some secrets belong to the earth itself, not to men." "Fever dreams," Dr. Miller dismissed. But Blackwood was staring at Sarah with new intensity. "The source," he breathed. "You've seen it, haven't you? Both of you." "It's just a dream, Father," Sarah said quickly. "The medicine often causes vivid dreams during healing." "Don't lie to me," Blackwood's voice rose sharply. "That's what your mother's pendant leads to, isn't it? The source of this healing water?" Thomas reached for his father's arm, his grip surprisingly strong for one so ill. "Father, wait. There's more to the dream. I saw what happens when men try to take the source for themselves." His voice grew unnaturally still. "I saw Reed swept away by water that moved like it was alive. I saw men with dynamite cause a cave-in that buried them all. And I saw you, Father, standing at a crossroads, forced to choose between your greed and your children." A chill ran through the tent. Mason and Sarah exchanged a glance. Thomas had somehow seen a future that hadn't happened yet. The wind outside rose to a howl, shaking the canvas walls of the tent. Rain began to fall, turning quickly to a downpour that drummed against the canvas like 1,000 impatient fingers. "Storm's here," Jackson observed from the tent entrance. "No ordinary storm," Mason replied, his hand moving instinctively toward the empty holster at his hip. A shout from outside drew their attention. Reed burst into the tent, his face wild, water streaming from his clothes. The knife had been removed from his shoulder, the wound roughly bandaged. "Blackwood!" he shouted. "The creek's rising! Flash flood coming down from the mountains!" Blackwood leaped to his feet. "Break camp! Get the horses to high ground!" As men scrambled to obey, Reed's eyes fixed on Sarah. "This is your doing, isn't it, witch?" he snarled, lunging for her. Jackson intercepted him, driving a fist into Reed's wounded shoulder. The bounty hunter howled in pain, but drew his pistol with his good hand. Before he could fire, Mason tackled him, sending both men crashing through the tent flap into the rain-soaked night. "Sarah, get Thomas out of here!" Mason shouted as he grappled with Reed in the mud. Outside, chaos reigned. The once gentle creek had become a raging torrent, sweeping away tents and equipment. Men struggled to control panicked horses as thunder boomed overhead. Sarah and Jackson helped Thomas to his feet. Despite his illness, fear lent him strength. They stumbled from the tent into the driving rain, making for higher ground. Mason and Reed fought savagely, each man knowing this was their final reckoning. Reed's youth and size were balanced by Mason's experience and desperation. They exchanged brutal blows, slipping and sliding in the mud. Reed gained the upper hand, pinning Mason beneath him. He pressed his pistol against Mason's temple, a savage grin splitting his bloody face. "Die knowing I'll find the source," he hissed. "And when I do, I'll be richer than Blackwood could ever dream." Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted. The creek bank, undermined by the flood, began to give way. Reed's expression changed from triumph to terror as the earth crumbled beneath him. He scrambled for solid ground, but it was too late. The bank collapsed, sending Reed tumbling into the raging creek. The current caught him instantly, sweeping him downstream. His scream was cut short as the black waters closed over his head. Mason clawed his way back from the edge, gasping for breath. Hands grabbed him, hauling him to safety. Jackson and Sarah pulled him up the slope to where Thomas stood with his father, watching the camp dissolve into the flood. "Just like in my dream," Thomas whispered. Blackwood stared at the raging waters, then at his son's face, understanding dawning in his eyes. "This is no ordinary storm," he said. "Is it?" "No," Sarah replied. "The creek is protecting itself." "From us," Blackwood finished. "From me." A terrible cracking sound drew their attention to the ridge above. A section of the mountain face, weakened by Reed's dynamite charges, was giving way. Tons of rock and earth slid into the valley, burying what remained of the camp. "We need to get to higher ground," Mason shouted over the storm. "The whole valley floor could go." They struggled upward, Thomas supported between his father and Jackson, Sarah and Mason leading the way. The few remaining members of Blackwood's party followed, shocked into silence by the catastrophe unfolding around them. They reached a rocky shelf just as another section of the valley floor collapsed, sending trees and boulders tumbling into the widening creek bed. "My God!" Blackwood breathed, watching his men and horses fighting the current below. "What have I done?" Sarah's pendant pulsed against her skin, hot as a coal. Without thinking, she pressed it between her palms, closing her eyes. Words came to her, not in English, but in Cherokee. Ancient words she somehow knew without learning. "Grandfather Water, hear me," she whispered. "Enough death. Show mercy to those who meant no harm." The rain slackened. The wind dropped. Below, the raging creek seemed to pause, its waters swirling in place rather than rushing onward. Men and horses, caught in the current, found themselves able to reach the banks. The flood didn't recede, but neither did it claim more victims. "What did you do?" Thomas asked in wonder. "She called to the water," Mason said, his voice filled with awe. "And it listened." Blackwood turned to his daughter, seeing her truly for perhaps the first time. Not as property, not as a servant, but as the inheritor of something ancient and powerful. "You control the water?" he asked. "No one controls it," Sarah replied. "I just asked it for mercy." Blackwood looked down at the devastation below, then back at his children. Thomas, still weak but standing on his own. Sarah, her face serene despite the destruction around them. "Your mother tried to tell me," he said, his voice breaking, "about the source, about you. I wouldn't listen." "It's not too late to listen now, Father," Thomas said quietly. Blackwood's shoulders slumped. He looked older suddenly, the fight gone out of him. "The truth," he repeated. "The truth is, I've been a fool, Sarah. Your mother tried to show me a better way, but I was too proud, too sure of myself." He took a halting step forward. "I didn't understand what I was doing. To you, to this place. Thomas made me see, made me remember the man I was when your mother loved me." Sarah regarded her father steadily. "Does that mean you'll stop hunting for the source? Will you leave these mountains in peace?" Blackwood hesitated, a lifetime of ambition warring with newfound understanding. "I saw what the water did to Reed," he said finally. "No natural flood moves like that. The old legends, your mother's stories, they're true, aren't they?" "Yes," Sarah answered simply, "and the source has chosen its protectors. I'm one of them now." Thomas stepped forward, moving with more strength than seemed possible. "Father, you have to let this go. The source isn't meant for men like us. Some gifts aren't ours to take." Blackwood looked between his children, the last remnants of the woman he had loved and lost. Something broke inside him, not his spirit, but the hardened shell he'd built around his heart. "You're right," he said softly. "Your mother would be proud of you both. I never understood her connection to these mountains, to the old ways. Maybe I was afraid of it." He straightened his shoulders with visible effort. "I won't look for the source again. You have my word." "And Jackson?" Sarah asked. "He saved my life." Blackwood glanced at the young cowboy. "He's welcome back at the ranch, with a promotion to foreman if he wants it." Jackson stepped forward to stand beside Sarah. Thank you, sir, but I think my place is here now. Blackwood nodded, something like understanding passing between the two men. You'll visit Thomas, he asked Sarah. He misses his sister. Of course, Sarah promised. Once he's strong enough to travel, bring him to Broken Ridge. I'll meet you there. As Blackwood turned to leave, he paused, looking back at Sarah. Your mother's pendant. May I see it? Just once? Sarah hesitated, then removed the stone from around her neck and handed it to her father. Blackwood studied it carefully, his fingers tracing the symbols etched into its surface. She wore this every day, he murmured. I should have listened when she tried to explain its importance. He handed it back to Sarah. Keep it safe. Keep yourself safe. With that, he turned and made his way carefully down the slope, Thomas at his side, a solitary pair against the vast wilderness. Do you trust him? Mason asked as they watched Blackwood disappear among the trees. Not entirely, Sarah admitted, but Thomas will hold him to his word. He's seen what happens when men try to control what should remain free. And if Thomas's health fails again, Sarah touched her pendant, then we'll be ready. Serene. The seasons turned. Summer brought new growth to the slopes where the flood had carved fresh channels. Mason and Sarah built a new cabin near the high cave, positioned to guard the approach to the source. Jackson rode regularly to Broken Ridge for supplies, gradually establishing himself as a link between the mountain dwellers and the town. Rumors spread about the healing woman who lived in the high country, and occasionally desperate people made the journey seeking help for ailments modern medicine couldn't cure. Sarah never turned them away, treating them with herbs and creek water, but never revealing the true source. Mason taught her everything he knew, and she added her mother's knowledge, creating new medicines that combined both traditions. One morning as Sarah gathered herbs from their garden, she noticed surveyors on the distant ridge, men with brass telescopes and measuring chains marking the land. Mason, she called, pointing to the ridge. Look! Mason shaded his eyes against the morning sun, his expression darkening as he recognized what they were seeing. Railroad men, he said grimly. The Union Pacific is pushing west again. What does it mean? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Means trouble, Mason replied. They'll want to cut through these mountains, blast tunnels, bring hundreds of workers. The source, Sarah whispered. They'll find it. Not if we can help it, Jackson said, joining them. Some things are worth fighting for. Mason nodded, his hand resting on the Remington at his hip. We've faced worse odds. That evening, Thomas arrived unexpectedly, riding a lathered horse up to their cabin as the sun set behind the mountains. The railroad, he gasped as he dismounted. They filed claims on half the county. Father's fighting them in court, but they have powerful friends in Washington. He caught his breath. I came to warn you. They'll be here within the month. Sarah squeezed her brother's hand. Thank you for the warning, but this isn't your fight. You're wrong, Thomas said firmly. Mother's blood flows in my veins too. I may not hear the creek speak, but I know what's right. He straightened, the last traces of illness gone from his bearing. I've been studying the law. There may be a way to protect this land legally. As they talked long into the night, planning their resistance, a young Shoshone girl appeared at the edge of the firelight, perhaps 12 years old, with serious eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond her years. I was told to come here, she said simply. My grandmother said you would teach me. Sarah, now carrying herself with the quiet confidence of one who had found her true calling, welcomed the girl without question. She recognized in those solemn eyes the same spark, the same connection to something ancient and powerful that she herself had discovered under Mason's tutelage. The circle continues, Mason observed, watching as Sarah showed the girl the pendant that now hung around her own neck. As it must. Is this how it was for you? Sarah asked. Finding me after all those years of waiting? Mason's pale eyes reflected the dancing flames. Similar yet different. Each guardian brings their own gifts, their own challenges. He smiled faintly. Your mother would be proud of what you've become, Sarah Blackwood, as am I. Later that night, when the others had retired, Sarah walked alone to the creek that flowed past their cabin. The autumn moon cast silver light across its surface, creating patterns that reminded her of the markings on her stone pendant. She knelt beside the water, dipping her fingers into the cool current. The water seemed to reach up to meet her touch, wrapping around her fingers like a living thing. True freedom is not the absence of bonds, she whispered, remembering the lessons she had learned through blood and tears and healing, but the strength to choose bonds that heal the world. The creek whispered back, its voice as ancient as the mountains themselves. And Sarah Blackwood, once a frightened girl fleeing violence, now guardian of the sacred waters, listened with her whole being. A new battle approached, steel and steam against stone and water. But tonight, beneath the watchful moon, the water spoke of courage and resilience, of cycles that continue despite all human efforts to break them. Sarah rose, strength flowing through her like the current beneath her feet. The railroad would come, but they would be ready. Some things were worth fighting for. Some bonds could never be broken, and the whispering creek would flow on as it had since the world began.